So, continuing from the previous video, we were talking about the structural factors affecting the interest group's role. We were discussing about the rules of the game and how certain constitutional guarantees like free speech and freedom of association affect the way interest groups perform within a given society. And I was giving the example of like how um, means if an interest group, you're not going to be able to say very much in a society where you would be thrown in jail if for protesting against the treatment of animals. So you're not going to be able to organize very well or protest or pass out pamphlets to people on the street if you don't have freedom of association. So one of the basic rule of the game or rules of society in a democracy is freedom of speech. And if you don't have that in place, or if you have that in a limited way, interest groups are not going to be nearly as effective. You also have in place um, that governs the political status of the interest group. So maybe interest groups are allowed to be formed, but they have to be checked out periodically by the government. And if they don't allow the government the access to their meeting, they can be shut down. Again, in the United States, we don't mm, see something like that. We have a strong freedom for such groups. On the other hand, in a more authoritarian society, there might be laws governing political status of such groups. Finally, there may be also laws governing how well interest group can access government, and here we think about things like limitations on campaign donations, or if interest groups need to register themselves if they want to lobby in Washington. um, you need to be part of official registry. This is simply so that the public has an idea of what kind of influence the interest groups have in society. Now, in US, there are a lot of back and forth, right? For certain points, there were no regulations of special interest. They could do what they wanted to, um, and this has often led to maybe corruption and too high of a degree of influence by interest groups. Uh, there was a movement for several decades where laws were put in place, the amount that interest groups could spend, so the degree to which they could influence, uh, um, so the degree to which they could act in anonymity. We have seen that pendulum switch back and forth. Interest group, especially business groups, are treated like anybody else, and they can act largely outside the control of society. But but those are kinds of rules that are put in place that would really impact how interest groups can act. Now, the another thing is rather than those general rules of the game, the other thing that matters is how the government itself structure. Again, we are talking about interest groups being on the input side of that little box where government is the central box, and input comes from the box. Well, how is that box structured? I'm referring to here like input output as analysis, where input is one box, government is the center box, then you have output. So we have to talk about this center box, how it is structured, and how that has influence on the input box. Here, we are referring to interest groups. You might have a very federal state which is broken into several units with lot of different access points. Think about the US. If you are going to influence government, do you simply go to Washington DC? No, you're going to have to really want impact something. Probably go to Albany or all the state capitals as well. There are far more access points, very different from society that is much more centralized, such as France, for example, where the unitary government doesn't give you that much uh, good or power outside central government in Paris. Again, that really impacts interest groups. A larger interest groups might be necessary to be effective in US because you really need to have the presence throughout the US. In France, probably it's easier to lobby because you simply be able to send a couple of people to Paris. So that's going to impact that structure is going to impact how you lobby and what kind of resources you need to um, be lobby effectively. So now that federal unitary divide, we also talked about parliamentary style of government and presidential style of government. Mm, with parliamentary style of government, you probably would just want to go, if you are lobbying, trying to influence government, probably just want to go to that single house or two houses of parliament, your Congress in the US. If you have the presidential system, what is what is going to happen is you probably need to lobby both the sides. So in parliament, both executive and legislature is one and same, so you just need to influence one of the houses. But in the presidential system, you need to probably lobby both sides. It's not enough to simply win over Congress or Parliament. You also need to make sure that the president, I mean, the executive side, is on board with your decision. So then again, that requires you to lobby more sides in a presidential system where power is divided than in a parliamentary government where it's all fairly centralized. Another aspect that's going to influence, another important aspect that's going to influence is the electoral system. You got the proportional representation system. You're probably going to go to the party itself. It's much more centralized process because then again there might be a large list of candidates and you don't know whether they're going to be elected or not. If you really want to influence change, people who are directly accountable to you, who you could threaten or say our group is not going to support you, your party, it's the party itself. That's the proportional representation electoral system for you. In US and other places where single member district, you could really need to go to the you don't really need to go to the party nearly as much if you want, especially if you want change at the local level. You can go to that local representatives who is far more accountable. um, um, and and you have much more leverage on one single individual than a small interest group is going to have um, difficulty saying to a party. Okay, so we are going to say, for example, we are going to withdraw our support from your party, and they would say, "Oh, now 5,000 votes. You really care about that?" But 5,000 votes in a local election can mean an awful lot to the same group to have a lot of leverage upon the local politician. So the point is like, you can have more leverage at the local level than if you are a small interest group than at the uh, larger level or the party level. Another aspect to consider uh, to do with the general structure, the way society is what we would call political culture. We talk about political culture later on in the course, but political culture is simply that which is acceptable within a given society, meaning what kind of things you can talk about. Let's say, for instance, in a society, is racism acceptable? Acceptable? Is it okay to talk about different races in a disparaging way? Can you talk about women disparagingly? Or those kind of or things are going to be different from society to society. So one big thing would be how acceptable is it for the church or for the trade union to express their opinion publicly. Um, in US, it's quite acceptable. The church has a tremendous amount of relevance. Politicians are regularly asked, what religion are you? Do you pray regularly? But in a different types of society like France, you ask a French politician like, "What's your view on capital punishment? What would Jesus say about it?" Then that French politician would say, "It's none of your business. It's private, because France is a secular state, and they would say their religious views have nothing to do with this." It would really limit the kind of access and power that the organized church has in France. But in the US, far different. Conversely, in the US, trade unions are not very powerful organizations. They are hugely powerful in Sweden, as we are going to see. As such, they matter a lot. So that's the difference in political culture. So in Sweden, every newspaper story that you read about policy, you're going to get a point of view from a trade union official because they are important. In US, they are not that important. Likewise, your society may feel differently about public protests. In France, there are tremendous culture of public protests, lots of strikes and mm, people parking their cars in the middle of the road to make a point. In US, you don't have a great attitude towards protest. It's not seen so much as a viable way of making your opinion known. Generally, people when people protest, half of the size going to feel like an invalid way of making your point or interest known. Mm, Go to voting booth. That's where you can make your preference known. But please don't disrupt society. That's what people in US feel. Um, on the other hand, in US, conversely, though, it's quite acceptable for big businesses to be very influential, to lobby, and to have a great larger role or more power than everyday people. In other types of society, they are far more distrustful of big business, and they have to be much more careful in how they lobby. But it's not so. But these things are uh, so these are the things about the political culture within a society that can really make certain interest groups more powerful in one society than in the other. Finally, I think you need to be very aware of the political economy, the economy in general of a society. Very powerful interest groups in the 1970s, 1960s in the US would have been the car or auto manufacturer. Our political economy as the political economy or economy shifted, we no longer strongly manufacturing economy. We are now mostly about services. So banks and computer software companies are more powerful lobbies now than would be auto industry, which no longer is responsible for many jobs or economic growth.